For historical context and more information, see the description below.
The mountains of the Bible hold a very significant place. They were a part of the life of the people. There were caves in which they hid themselves when they needed hiding places. There were also their homes. The high places of the earth served as landmarks, as did Mount Hor, indicating the boundary of the Promised Land. There were platforms from which speeches were given. There were excellent sites for military camps. They became burial grounds. They were regarded as holy places. It was very natural to hear words such as, "Get thee up into a high mountain, or I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills." And what a great events there were that took place on them. It was on one of them, remember, that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. It was on Mount Carmel that Elijah defied the gods of Baal. It was on another that Aaron and Hur enabled Moses to hold up the banner when his own strength was faltering and turned the tide of the battle. It was on a mountain that Christ was crucified. It was from another he delivered the greatest sermon of all time. He went through anguish on one of them. He was crucified on another. Some great and tragic events took place on the mountains. There were places of vista, places where men were, in the words of Tennyson, enabled to look into the future far as human eye could see. And in this Lenten series, we're going to talk about 4 of them in particular. Today I'm going to speak on the view from Sinai. Next week, the view from Mount Carmel. And Mr. Cromie will speak to the view from Mount Ararat. And I shall preach the last of the series on Calvary. Nathaniel Hawthorne said of Mount Greylock, "It appeared to better advantage the higher the point from which I viewed it." That's very true of life. We're going to take a look at it from some of the high places of the Bible. The view from Mount Sinai is the view through the eyes of law, the eyes of moral law, the laws of God, if you will. And we do need to take a look at that. Governor Carl Sanders of Georgia was asked, "What, in your opinion, is the greatest moral problem facing our nation today?" He said the United States was founded upon faith in God and grew great in the adherence of the American people to his commandments. Our salvation as a nation and as a people lies in a renewal of that faith and a rededication to those commandments. Until this is accomplished, we can expect immorality in our country, already rampant enough, to continue on its destructive path. End of quote. Someone said just a couple of weeks ago, I forget who, that the greatest problem facing the United States today is not what is going to take place in Vietnam, not what's happening in Russia, not what is happening on the stock market. The greatest unanswered question, he said, in the United States of America today is whether or not she can survive without God. And this was not the statement of a minister. The first part of the quote from Carl Sanders, of course, was inaccurate. Never have we adhered as a people to the commandments of God. No nation has. But the last warning is well taken. We must lay hold on a dedication to some moral and spiritual standards that are in truth commandments. And we haven't been giving enough thought to them. The result has been a growing disrespect for all kinds of law, as was indicated by a college student who said to his chaplain, "Nobody knows what's right these days. Who's to tell? What difference does it make what you do? All you can do is guess what's right." Well, the view from Sinai says that there are at least a few guideposts to take some of the guessing out of life as to what is right and wrong. The view from Sinai brings us face to face with 10 commandments. Where did they come from? There are those who have claimed from earliest times of biblical history that God literally spoke these words to Moses. Others have pointed out that many excavations have shown that several of the laws were known, at least in part, centuries before Moses was born, and that there is a distinct relationship between them and the ancient code of Hammurabi. But regardless of the interpretation one takes, they still point to a divine origin. There is only difference in method. The 12th verse of the 24th chapter of Exodus says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Come up to me into the mount, and be there. And I will give you tables of stone and a law, and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them." I believe that God has been slowly writing those commandments into the consciousness of men through the centuries. Moses became his agent to summarize them, to make them known to the people. "And the Lord said unto Moses, Come up to me in the mount, and be there. And I will give thee tables of stone and a law, and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them." How carefully God selects his people. How supremely qualified, for instance, was Schweitzer for the job that God had for him to do. And Abraham Lincoln for his. And Winston Churchill for his. Isaiah for his, and Paul for his, and Moses for his. Condemned to death as a child, hidden by a mother who loved him, found by a member of the royal family, brought up in a palace where he had excellent teachers and where he was able to gain knowledge of history and science and the law. He was able to learn the things which had gone before. It says in Scripture that he was learned in all the laws of the Egyptians. He endures, says the book of Hebrews, as seeing him who is invisible. And God tapped him on the shoulder. God spoke to Moses. Sometimes God does it through a great event. Sometimes he does it through a thing of beauty. Sometimes through a preacher or through a teacher. Sometimes he does it through history, sometimes he does it through a great need. And probably the last named more than anything else was the medium God used in speaking to Moses. The great need of his people, the need became God's voice. And Moses was aware of it. And so he went down from the mountain and he taught the commandments to his people. What were they? Someone has said not a set of regulations to be committed to memory, but a set of principles to be committed to life. They're universal in their application. There's probably only one section in the Old Testament where brevity of form, where breadth of spirit is greater than in the Ten Commandments. And that's in that magnificent portion in the 6th chapter of Micah, where he says, "He has showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." If there's any section that can surpass the Ten Commandments, the relationship of man to God and God to man and man's responsibility to God, it's that. The commandments are divided into two sections. Some claiming that the first 4 verses are those that have to do with religious duties, the last 6 with moral duties. Some scholars divide them 5 and 5. The first one, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." What means it, asks Martin Luther, to have a God? And he replies that whatever thy heart clings to and relies upon, that is properly thy God. Think on that. Mankind has had too many of them. But from the worship of one God, so much is owed in our entire history of civilization. The consciousness of mankind is one family. The consciousness of living in one world. It goes back to this concept of one God over all. The second commandment, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image." This is a protest against man's own man-made gods, of which there were plenty in the days of Moses and unfortunately in our own day. "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." This was originally spoken to safeguard the sanctity of oaths. But it also means that we should not make any careless nor blasphemous use of God's name. Third, or fourth, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Dr. Coffin has pointed out that the people of Israel were a great people for setting aside segments of things. One nation, Israel, was holy. One tribe, Levi, was made the priestly code. One building, the temple at Jerusalem, was sacred as God's dwelling place. One part of the harvest, the first fruits, were to be given to God. One day in every 7 was to be kept free from labor as a religious festival. It's a good thing systematically to recognize God by setting aside a part of one's time, one's substance, one's energy. Fifth, honor thy father and thy mother, for thus we add solidarity to the family life and we glorify God. And of course, it infers that the father and mother are going to be worthy of honor. Sixth, thou shalt not kill. Respect for human life has been increasing, we hope, through the years. But there are still so many ways of killing people, and we still seek respectable names for murder. But every time we go to war, every time we enforce capital punishment, every time that persons die from neglect, this sixth commandment comes back to trouble us with a demand that we're just not quite sure we've even come close to satisfying. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. The assertion of the sanctity of the marriage tie. Thou shalt not steal. There are more ways of stealing than just taking a pair of stockings from a department store counter. Or should we remind ourselves of that in income tax time? Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Slandering with one's tongue is such dangerous and such cruel business. Probably it will help us if we remember that what we see in a man, what we draw out of them, what we say of them, is a very telling indication of what we are. And finally, 10th, thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's. Of course, we immediately ask ourselves, what's the man talking about? If there ever was a people that was guilty of coveting, it was the people of Israel, and Moses was their leader, taking them into the promised land. Wasn't he coveting everything in the land of Canaan? But if one had asked that question of him, he would, according to the enlightenment of the day, have said that the people of Canaan were not neighbors. Only the people of Israel were neighbors to the people of Israel. But we don't have that excuse as Christians. And it says to us, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Of course, it also says later on in the Bible that we should covet earnestly the best things. And that's your homework. Figure out what things are Christian to covet. And so it's quite a view from Sinai, isn't it? Why have people through the centuries kept going back to take another look at what was seen there? Well, in the first place, there's that haunting timelessness of the commandment. The mind of man, the thinking of man, the appraisals of man, they're all such fickle things. They change so. For instance, Huey Long, and at least some of us are old enough to remember him, Huey Long wanted to take from the rich and give to the poor. And every deserving family would be guaranteed a home worth $5,000, an income of $2,000, a car, a radio, washing machine, and free education for the children. And he was called the most dangerous demagogue that this nation ever produced. Just a few weeks ago, a presidential commission recommended that every American family be guaranteed not just $2,000, but $3,000. And whereas the Kingfish limited his giving to the deserving, the latest recommendation is no such provision. How thinking has changed in just one generation. Some of us recall, too, a dear old gentleman named Dr. Thomson. He proposed that every person over 60 be given $200 a month, provided that he spend it all before the next paycheck came. This spending would guarantee, he inferred, that a perpetual prosperity would go on. They called him a crackpot. And yet there are millions in this nation who feel that we've already gone him one better. How the thinking has changed in one generation. I came to this country in 1934. And I remember listening to a man speaking, a man whose name was Norman Thomas. And I was told that this man ran for president on the socialist ticket every time a presidential election came up. There weren't a great many who said he was red, but they said he's a very dark shade of pink. And that he was dangerous to the whole American way of life. Yet today, whether they want to confess it or not, the platform of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that has to do with social issues are basically the old platforms of Norman Thomas. All this in 30 years. I wonder how many of the ideas we brand as dangerous today, many of the ideas we think are unthinkable, are going to be accepted as a part of life 30 years from now. I'm not debating whether it's right or not. It may be the greatest thing in the world. I refer to these facts for one reason only. What eternity must have been in the Ten Commandments that they could survive the fickleness of man's mind through all these centuries and still stand when interpreted in the spirit of Christ as the conscience of mankind. The civil law of pagan Rome underlies all the Western jurisprudence, and it was influenced by the basic morality of the Mosaic law. When well pointed out by William Albright that the humanitarian tone of our contemporary laws can be traced directly back to the Torah and that our Western attitude towards sexual morality, for instance, came almost entirely from the law of Moses and hinges on the Ten Commandments. They've never been repealed, and they've never been outdated. Man has tried to break them, of course, but he has always ended up by being broken on them. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn was speaking for a good many when he said, "What's the use learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and it's no trouble to do wrong?" No one who has lived very much of life can feel that way about it. It is a trouble to do wrong. And I'm not saying, of course, that it isn't troublesome to do right. Jesus did right and he finished up on the cross. But there's a difference. When a man gets into trouble after having done right, he has the feeling that he has struck a blow for that which someday is going to be. But when he is wrong and is defeated, then there's nothing but the blackest darkness in his soul. Way back in that old book of Ecclesiastes are the words, "A wise man's heart inclines him toward the right, but a fool's heart toward the left. He that diggeth a pit shall fall, and whoso breaketh a hedge, a serpent shall bite." Figuratively speaking, we're surrounded by hedges. And we would better learn what it means to respect them. Jesus said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." That freedom comes from disciplining ourselves to truth. We're free, we're at liberty. But we're at liberty inside law. We're at liberty not to do as we please, but we're at liberty to do as we ought. We're not so much free from something as we're free for something, and he is expressing liberty at his best who recognizes that there are rules and regulations in the living of life that he dare not break, lest he become a slave of self-indulgence or something worse. The Ten Commandments remain because man's efforts to break them have always resulted in his being broken. The fact is, man should never look upon them as being troublesome restraints, but as needful helps. When Edward Gibbon finished writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he walked out into the garden feeling with the finish of his work that he had been freed from a demanding taskmaster. But later he wrote, "My pride was soon humbled, and a sober melancholy was spread over my mind by the idea that I had taken an everlasting leave of an old and agreeable companion." He felt that that which had held him down had been his friend all the way. And that's true of the commandments, especially when expressed through the gospel of Christ. At times it may look as if these demands would take all the fun out of life, and it would be a release to be rid of them. But in the long pull, they're our friends. Yellow lines, if you will, along the roadway that are not to be crossed. Lines that are there not only to show us light, but a life that is more abundant. History says that that's the view we get from Sinai. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.